Good day, everyone, especially to my classmates in this subject and to our dear Professor, Sir Vincent Buron, who are watching this video presentation. My name is Sir Richie Panes, and I'm going to present part of the topic pertaining to the performance evaluation using variances from standard cost as a continuation to the previous reporters. Before that, let us first discuss the relationship of this topic to our previous topic pertaining to budgeting. We know that budgeting is very important for businesses, not only for businesses, but to all of us, because this will serve as a guiding tool and a direction on where the businesses will go. But its importance will not be fully recognized unless we will apply this topic of performance evaluation using variances, because this is also the tool where the businesses will measure the effectiveness of its budgeting against its actual operation. To continue, let us directly to the assigned practical exercises and discuss side by side and the theory and the problem. Under practical exercise 23-3A, the problem stated as follows. Brewster Company produced 1,500 units of product that required 1.5 standard hours per unit. The standard variable overhead cost per unit is $1.7 per hour. The actual variable factory overhead was 3,900. What is being asked in this problem? We need to determine the variable factory overhead controllable variance. What is if variable factory overhead controllable variance? Please take note that the variable factory overhead controllable variance is the difference between the actual variable overhead incurred and the budgeted variable overhead for actual production. Since we're talking about variances, there must be two elements that is being compared. In this case, the two elements being compared is the actual variable overhead against the budgeted variable overhead. The result will be either favorable or unfavorable. If the actual variable overhead is less than the budgeted variable overhead, the variance is favorable. And if the actual variable overhead exceeds the budgeted variable overhead, the variance is unfavorable. For what reason and purpose? Why do we need to measure and determine the controllable variance of the said factory overhead? It is simply because through this measurement, we will be able to know the efficiency of the usage of the factory overhead resources. The managers of the businesses will be rated how efficient and effective they are in managing the Z resources. Going back to our problem, the actual variable overhead incurred is equivalent to $3,900. On the other hand, the budgeted variable overhead is equivalent to $3,825. How do we get the budgeted variable overhead of 3,825? It is simply multiplying the production of 1,500 units by the standard hours of 1.5 per unit and then by the standard cost of 1.7 per hour. What is the result? Is it favorable or unfavorable? The result is unfavorable of 75 units. The variable factory overhead controllable variance indicates management ability to keep the factory overhead costs within the budget limits. Now let's go to the other exercise. Tipton Company produced 800 units of product that required 4 standard hours per unit. The standard variable overhead cost per unit is 4.50 per hour. The actual variable factor overhead was $14,100. We need to determine the variable factory overhead controllable variance. In this problem, what do you think? Is it favorable or unfavorable? It is favorable. By how much? Favorable by $1,580. How do we get it or how do we solve it? Let us go first to the actual variable overhead incurred. It is equivalent to $14,100 as the problem says. Then how about the budgeted variable overhead? It is equivalent to 15,680. How do we get 15,680? It is simply multiplying 800 units by 4 hours, then by $4.50 per hour. And so the result is favorable by $1,580, simply because the actual variable overhead incurred is lesser than the budgeted variable overhead. Next, in this problem, as a continuation to the practical exercise being assigned, a Fraser company produced 1,500 units of product that required 1.5 standard hours per unit. The standard fixed overhead cost per unit is $0.50 per hour at 2,500 hours, which is 100% of normal capacity. As you can notice, our first problem is just the same company with this problem. But what is being asked in this problem? We need to determine the variable fixed factory overhead volume variance. Again, what is this variable fixed factory overhead volume variance? The fixed factory overhead volume variance is the difference between the budgeted fixed overhead at 100% of normal capacity and the standard fixed overhead for the actual production achieved during the period. So, the result will also be, it's either be favorable or unfavorable. If the standard fixed overhead exceeds the budgeted overhead at 100% of normal capacity, the variance is favorable. If the standard fixed overhead is less than the budgeted overhead at 100% of normal capacity, the variance is unfavorable. This type of variance is being used in order to determine the usage of PPE. If the result is favorable, then the firm used its plant and equipment more than would be expected under normal operating conditions. If the result is unfavorable, the company used its plant and equipment less than would be expected under normal operating conditions. Going back to our problem, what is the budgeted fixed overhead at 100% of normal capacity? It is 2,500 hours. How about the standard fixed overhead for the actual production? It is 2,250 hours. At this point, can we able to determine the variance? Not yet. Why? Because we, we need to know the difference between the difference in terms of hours between the budgeted and the standard fixed. Then we're going to multiply the standard unit or the standard fixed unit of 0.50 per hour in order to arrive at an unfavorable variance of $125,000. So how do we get the standard fixed overhead of 2,250? It is simply multiplying 1,500 units by 1.5 standard hours. So as you can see, the standard fixed overhead for the actual production is less than the budgeted fixed overhead at 100% of normal capacity. Then the result is unfavorable. Moving to the next problem, or the volume variance, sorry. The volume variance measures the use of fixed overhead resources, as I have mentioned a while ago. Moving to the next, this is just the same from the other problem. Okay, Pipton Company produced 800 units of product that required 4 standard hours per unit. The standard fixed overhead cost per unit is $1.20 per hour at 3,000 hours, which is 100% of normal capacity. So we need to determine the fixed factory overhead volume variance. What will be the result? Is it favorable or unfavorable? It is favorable. Favorable by how much? By $240,000. So how do we get it? Let's go to the budgeted fixed overhead at 100% of normal capacity. It is 3,000 hours. How about the standard fixed overhead for the actual production? It is 3,200 hours. How do we get it? We simply multiply 800 units at 4 hours times 4 hours. And then the result is $240. That is favorable. How do we arrive at this $240? Simply 200 hours multiplied by the 1.2 standard hours. Learn something from this small presentation, and thank you so much. Again, this is Richie Panes reporting.